sleet stung Karen Stewart's face until her skin went numb, then burned again when the wind shifted across Market Cross and drove the needles sideways. Her hem clung to her calves, soaked to the knee. Her shoes had split at one seam last week, and the wet had found both stockings before she reached the apothecary lane. She kept one hand closed around the paper packet inside her shawl, though the paper had already softened at the corners from damp and from the heat of her palm. Laudanum, 2 ounces. All the coin she had gathered in 6 weeks from mending cuffs for the kitchen maids at night and copying church notices for Mrs. Davies when no one was looking. The old groom, Mr. Bell, had coughed through dawn again. He had once ridden beside her father when the fields were still theirs, and the windows at Stewart House held warm light. Now he slept in a draughty corner behind the coach shed with lungs that rattled as though someone had left stones in his chest. The apothecary had not reduced his price when she told him that. He had looked at her cracked knuckles and asked for payment first. By the time she turned onto Stewart Lane, her fingers had split open at the creases from lye, cold, and too much water. The cuts were shallow, but each one flared when sleet touched it. She tucked her hands under her arms for warmth and walked faster because she could not afford to lose the medicine, and she could not afford to be late for evening service in the house that had once called her daughter. 2 gentlemen under a shop awning watched her pass with the blank attention reserved for hired help. A fishmonger's wife shifted her basket to let Karen squeeze by and did not meet her eye. Her shawl was patched twice at the shoulder. Her collar had frayed to threads. Her face, in the apothecary glass, briefly reflected between jars of willow bark and gentian, had looked thinner than she remembered, the cheekbones too sharp, the eyes too large and dark for her pale skin. Plain, the sisters called her, when they wished to be kind. Useful, when they wished to be cruel. She climbed the last rise with wet hair clinging to the back of her neck, her stomach hollow and twisting, and told herself she could still reach the kitchen before the bread was cleared. Stewart House came into view with no firelight in the upper windows, only grey panes and the black line of the roof against a darker sky. The courtyard mud had churned into deep ruts where cart wheels had passed since noon. 2 hired men, strangers to her, were carrying trunks through the side gate with the practised speed of men paid by the hour. Not kitchen baskets, not coal scuttles. Trunks with brass corners and painted initials she did not know. They moved past her without bowing, one shoulder striking her sleeve hard enough to turn her sideways. Karen regained her balance at the servants' stair and saw the door to the attic landing standing open for the first time in years. Cold air spilled down from above. She climbed, breath tight in her throat, one step then another, with the laudanum packet pressed against her ribs, and reached the corridor where her room had always stood at the end, beneath the eaves where rain drummed loud in autumn and frost formed fern-like silver on the inside of the pane. The door was shut. Fresh paint shone in the dim light, a hard cream colour where once there had been worn blue. A new brass lock sat bright and clean above the latch. No scrape marks, no old keyhole, no sign that her hand had ever turned it. She stood there until the stranger below called for another trunk, and boots thudded up the stair behind her. Mrs. Stewart's perfume arrived first, lavender water sharp enough to sting the nose, then the rustle of dove-grey silk moving through the narrow passage as if it were a drawing-room she had graciously visited, not a servants' landing that smelled of damp plaster and coal dust. Mrs. Stewart stopped an arm's length away and examined Karen from bonnet ribbon to wet shoe as though taking account of damaged goods. "You are in the path," she said. "Move!" Karen did not move. The laudanum packet softened further under her hand. "My room is locked." Mrs. Stewart's mouth did not shift. "Idle daughters do not keep rooms. The chamber has been leased for the quarter. A respectable widow and her niece will occupy it by nightfall." Karen looked at the new lock again because the words did not settle at once. "My books are inside." "Were inside," Mrs. Stewart corrected. "Your books, your poor shawl, your boots with the split soles, all of it has been bundled to the coal shed. You had no right to leave your refuse where paying guests require space." A maid behind Mrs. Stewart lowered her eyes. One of the footmen passed on the stair with a crate of china and glanced through Karen as if she were part of the wall. "I went for Mr. Bell's medicine," Karen said, and heard how thin her voice sounded in the painted corridor. Mrs. Stewart's gloved fingers settled over her reticule clasp. "Then you have had an outing. You should be grateful." The words landed with the clean precision of a gate shutting. Karen tasted iron where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. She gave the laudanum packet to the scullery boy to carry to Mr. Bell, and watched him run because she could not trust her hands to hold anything without shaking. When she returned to the passage, the stranger's trunks had already crossed the threshold of her room. She caught one glimpse past a servant's shoulder, her old stool pushed into the hall, her cracked basin gone, the Bible her father had given her no longer on the sill. Mrs. Stewart turned at the stair, silk whispering. "You will sleep in the carriage house tonight," she said without looking back. "No fire is to be laid for you. Perhaps discomfort will instruct usefulness." Karen followed her down in silence because speaking would have made no difference and because silence cost less strength. In the kitchen, cook avoided her eyes and sliced one stale heel from the loaf left near the ovens. No butter, no broth. The heel sat in Karen's palm like a stone. She ate it standing beside the pump with wet shoes still on, each swallow dragging at her throat. After dark, she crossed the yard to the carriage house, skirts lifted from mud that still soaked through, and found a folded horse blanket on the floorboards behind an empty phaeton. No lamp, no brazier. The draught came under the doors in long knives carrying the smell of old leather and cold iron. Mice moved in the straw along the wall. She took off her shoes and winced when skin peeled at both heels, raw where the wet stockings had rubbed all day. She wrapped her feet in the least damp part of her petticoat, then sat with her back against a wheel and drew her knees to her chest to keep the shivering from shaking her teeth. The hunger returned quickly, sharper after bread with no substance. She thought of the attic room in details she could not stop naming. The slope of the ceiling where she had hung dried lavender from the garden years ago. The loose floorboard under the bed where she hid paper and a stub of pencil. The shelf her father had hammered crookedly because he laughed through the work and never measured first. He had taught her letters there by candlelight while rain beat the shingles. He had traced legal terms with his finger on old account books and told her that knowledge sat in the hand and stayed even when coin did not. 3 years since his burial, and still she could hear him clearing his throat before reading aloud. 3 years since debts appeared from desks he never let her open, notes called in by men who had once dined at their table, signatures she did not recognize and could not contest. 2 months after his grave was closed, Mrs. Stewart remarried quietly and returned to Stewart House with stamped authority and 2 daughters in velvet sleeves. The house changed room by room. First the music room, then the blue parlour, then the pantry keys, then the wages ledger. Karen had been moved upward, outward, and finally out of sight. Near midnight, rain replaced sleet and drummed on the carriage roof in a steady, hard line. She did not sleep so much as lose pieces of time between shivers. Once she woke to hoofbeats in the yard and men laughing near the gate. Once she woke because her fingers had gone so numb she could not feel whether they were folded or open. She pressed them under her arms until feeling returned as pain. The next bell she heard was the half hour before dawn. Grey light seeped under the carriage doors, colourless and mean. A housemaid named Martha came with a folded paper held out at arm's length as if it might stain her apron. Her face was pinched with apology. She could not risk speaking. Karen broke the seal with stiff fingers and read by the weak strip of light. Mrs. Stewart's hand was angular and firm across the page. Miss Karen Stewart is to remove herself from these premises by noon this day. Any continued presence shall be treated as trespass and reported accordingly. No signature of affection, no acknowledgement of kinship. Only the legal style Mrs. Stewart had learned quickly and wielded eagerly. Karen read it twice. On the second reading, the words steadied became plain fact. Leave by noon. Reported if she stayed. She rose with her knees locked from cold and crossed to the coal shed before the household stirred. Mud sucked at her shoes with each step. Her breath showed white. The shed door had always hung crooked, the latch loose enough that a child could lift it with 2 fingers. This morning a new iron hasp held it shut, thick and dark with fresh screws. She touched it once, then knocked, then tried the side panel where wood had rotted last winter. Repaired. Even that. Through a crack between boards she could see the shape of bundled cloth in the corner, tied with twine. Her shawl, perhaps. Her books, perhaps. Her winter boots. Close enough to name and unreachable. The second lock in less than 12 hours made her stomach clench harder than hunger had. A groom crossing the yard looked away when he saw her at the door. From the upper windows came the muffled sound of furniture being moved in her old room. Then a woman's laugh she did not know. Karen lowered her hand from the hasp and stood in the morning cold, while the house continued around her, ordered and occupied, as if she had already gone. Karen kept standing until the cold reached her ribs, then turned from the coal shed because staring at an iron hasp would not make it open, and because the yard had begun to fill with the small sounds of a household that had made room for everyone except her. A milk cart rattled through the rear gate. Someone in the kitchen split kindling. On the upper landing a door shut and shut again, the measured rhythm of guests settling in to what had been her corner of the house. She crossed to the pump, washed mud from her hands in water so cold it made her knuckles ache, and went in through the scullery where steam and onion and old ash thickened the air. Martha caught her sleeve near the dresser and pressed a chipped mug into her palm. Weak tea, almost colourless, but warm. "Drink quickly," the maid whispered without moving her lips. Karen nodded and drank in 2 swallows. The heat sat in her stomach like a promise too small to trust. Mrs. Stewart's bell rang from the morning room, one short pull that demanded attendance without urgency, because urgency was for equals and servants, not for daughters reduced to neither one thing nor the other. Karen set the mug down and went when called. She paused at the threshold because her shoes left wet marks on the polished floor, and because that room had once held her father's writing desk, the walnut one with the ink stain at the right corner where he rested his hand while reading aloud. The desk was gone now. In its place stood a lacquer table crowded with porcelain shepherdesses, and a vase of hothouse roses flown in from somewhere warmer than this county had any right to be in March. Mrs. Stewart sat upright in dove-grey silk, wrists ringed in jet beads, a neat stack of folded household accounts beside her elbow like a magistrate's exhibits. Amelia and Louisa, those beautiful daughters with their pale ribbons and polished hair, ate hot rolls spread thick with orange marmalade and watched Karen with open amusement. "You are late," Mrs. Stewart said. "I was at the coal shed, Ma'am." "You were where you were not invited." Mrs. Stewart slid a narrow ledger across the table with one gloved finger. "You will sign acknowledgement of departure before noon." Karen looked down. The page named her as dependent resident, no wages due, no claim upon furnishings, no right of re-entry once removed. Legal language tightened like wire across each line. Her father had taught her those words when she was 15, tapping each clause with the back of his pen and telling her that papers were doors also, and that people who smiled while offering a document often asked for more than ink. She heard his voice so clearly that for one brief second she could smell tobacco and sealing wax instead of lavender water. She did not sign. "My father settled a marriage trust on this house," she said quietly. Amelia laughed first, a bright little sound. Louisa followed. Mrs. Stewart did not. "Your father settled debts," she answered. "He concealed them from all sensible counsel. He borrowed against fields already pledged. He borrowed against timber not yet cut. He borrowed against a future that did not arrive. I paid what I could. I preserved what remained. You speak of trust as if sentiment were currency." Karen's fingers tightened at her sides, the split skin stinging. She remembered the winter after her father died. Men in dark coats standing in this same room while rain tapped the panes, their hats in their hands and their eyes everywhere except her face. One held promissory notes. One held a list of arrears. One had the kindness to look ashamed when he asked for the silver candelabra her mother had brought to the marriage. Her mother had been gone 7 years by then, buried in the churchyard under slate that tilted each spring, and could not answer for any of it. Her father's widow had answered instead. She answered with signatures, with sales, with a second wedding conducted at half-light in a chapel 2 parishes away. And she returned from it with new advisers, new locks, new certainty. Karen had been told to move from the blue chamber to the narrow room beneath the eaves that same week. Temporary, they said, practical, then permanent by repetition. "If you will not sign," Mrs. Stewart said, folding her hands, "you may still go. The law does not require your gratitude." Louisa reached for another roll and spoke around the edge of her smile. "Perhaps she expects to be begged to remain. We could dress her and set her in the hall like an heirloom chair." Amelia leaned back, bracelets chiming. "No, an heirloom is valuable." The words were familiar in structure and fresh in detail, which was their method. Never one grand cruelty when 10 small ones could be arranged before luncheon. Karen met Mrs. Stewart's gaze because meeting the sisters would grant them too much. "Where is the key to the coal shed?" she asked. "With the steward." Mrs. Stewart took up her pen. "He has instructions not to assist you." She left the morning room without permission, which earned her a sharp call of her name from behind, and then silence when she did not return at once. In the back passage she waited for the shaking in her hands to settle, then went downstairs to the still room where Mrs. Davies kept vinegar jars, and dried rosemary hung from twine. The housekeeper looked up, took in Karen's face, and understood more than either of them could safely say. "You should eat," Mrs. Davies murmured, cutting half a heel from yesterday's loaf and wrapping it in cloth before anyone else entered. Karen tucked it into her pocket and asked for the steward. She found him at the account desk, off the servants' hall, spectacles low on his nose, his expression already arranged into polite refusal. "I cannot release anything from the shed without written authority. You saw my trunk moved there yesterday." "I saw bundles moved there." His pen scratched deliberately across a column of figures. "Please step aside, miss. Deliveries are due." She stepped aside because carts had begun to back through the yard, and men carrying flour sacks did not stop for a woman with no room and no status. One brushed her shoulder hard enough to spin her half a turn. No apology. She stood by the wall while the house absorbed goods meant to feed other mouths, and she counted what had been stripped from her life, as if the count itself might keep it from disappearing. Her winter boots, patched twice at the toe, 2 wool shifts, her father's psalter with his initials in fading gold, a Latin grammar missing its back cover, 3 copybooks tied in blue ribbon, 1 silver thimble dented at the rim, the dark green shawl that had been her mother's, the little ivory comb with 2 teeth broken, the half candle stubs she saved in a tin, the key to the old escritoire that no longer stood in any room she could enter, the folded paper where her father had once written in a hurried hand, "Karen knows the upper pasture bounds better than any surveyor." He had laughed when he wrote it, ink on his thumb, and called her his sharp-eyed steward while she blushed and pretended annoyance. That paper had no legal force, neither had memory. Yet she could not abandon either without feeling as if he were being buried a second time. By the 2nd hour after sunrise, the sleet had thinned to a hard, bright drizzle, and Amelia sent for her to carry hat boxes from the upper wardrobe to the carriage because the sisters were visiting Lady Morrow for cards. Karen lifted each lacquered box with care she did not receive in return. Louisa stopped her on the stair and pinched the sleeve of Karen's dress between 2 fingers. "This was mine once," she said, "when I was 12. Karen looked down at the faded muslin. The hem had been let out twice. The waist sat wrong. "It was given to me with your cast-offs." Louisa's mouth curved. "Then do not stain it." In the front hall, a footman took the boxes from Karen without meeting her eye, and handed them to the coachman as if passing freight. Mrs. Stewart descended last. Rustle of silk, scent of lavender, kid gloves buttoned to the wrist. She paused at Karen's shoulder and spoke softly enough that only Karen could hear. "You imagine this is cruelty because you confuse sentiment with entitlement. You were fed. You were housed. You were tolerated beyond prudence. If you had accepted a place as governess when it was offered, this unpleasantness might have been avoided." Karen remembered that offer. A widower in Dorset, 3 unruly sons, half wages withheld for board, a contract she was not allowed to read before agreeing. Mrs. Stewart had called it salvation. Mrs. Davies had called it transportation in polite dress, and pressed Karen's hand until she understood the warning. Karen had refused and paid for refusal ever since. "I will need my books," she said. Mrs. Stewart's expression did not alter. "Need is not the standard by which households are run." Then she stepped into the carriage, and the door shut, and the horses took the gravel with a spray of wet stones as they pulled away. Karen watched until the wheels disappeared beyond the yew hedge. The house seemed larger in her absence and colder in her presence. By late morning, the bells from St. Jude's marked the quarter hours with indifferent clarity, each strike shaving away what remained before noon. Karen returned to the carriage house for the small parcel she had made in the night. 1 clean collar, a mending needle wrapped in thread, the stale bread in cloth, and the few coins she had hidden in the lining of her reticule where no one had yet thought to search. She knelt once more by Mr. Bell's cot behind the coach shed and found him half awake, cheeks hollow, breath whistling. "Did the medicine help?" she asked. He nodded, then coughed and caught her wrist with surprising strength. "Your father would not—" He broke off, searching for air. "He would not have let this stand." The words struck harder than pity would have done. "He is not here," Karen answered, because softness would have broken her voice. Mr. Bell's hand fell back to the blanket. She adjusted it over his shoulder and promised to return before dark, though she did not know where she would be by then, only that promises were the last currency she could still spend without asking permission. In the servants' passage, Martha appeared again, pale and urgent, and pressed something into Karen's palm. A key, small and iron, cold from the maid's hand. "For the attic writing box," Martha whispered. "I found it behind the washstand. I do not know if it opens anything now." Karen closed her fingers around it, stunned by the weight of such a small mercy. "If they ask, you never saw me." Martha nodded once and vanished toward the kitchens. Karen tucked the key into her bodice, where it rested against her skin like a heartbeat she did not trust to continue. At 5 minutes before noon, she crossed the front hall, because leaving by the back would look like guilt, and she had been made to look guilty often enough for things she had not done. The porter stood by the door with his hands behind his back and stared over her shoulder, as if awaiting someone of rank. When Karen reached the threshold, he lifted the bar and opened the door just wide enough for her to pass with her parcel. Rain had begun again, thin and steady. Across the lane, 2 women under a shared umbrella turned to look, saw her single bundle, and then looked away with the swift discretion of those who understood exactly what they were seeing. Karen stepped onto the stones, and the door closed behind her with a decisive click that echoed down the portico like a lock turning in every room at once. Karen stood on the wet stones a moment longer, the parcel pressed against her ribs, while rain threaded from the portico roof and ran down the back of her collar. The street beyond Stuart House held no shelter she could claim, and no face that would turn kindly when it recognised her. A baker's boy passed with a handcart and looked at her bundle first, then at the closed door, then away. She began walking because stillness in that lane would be read as pleading, and she had done enough pleading for one life. Her shoes took water at once. The cut seam at the left toe widened. Cold moved up through wool and skin into bone. At Market Cross, the posting inn stood broad and dark against the weather, its signboard creaking as wind caught the chain. Carts crowded the yard. Steam rose from horse flanks. The stable wall leaked warmth through old stone where the kitchen chimney ran, and she took that narrow strip as if it were a gift. 2 ostlers rolled a barrel past her and did not speak. A woman in travel clothes stepped down from a coach, glanced at Karen's wet hem and bare parcel, and drew her cloak tighter as though poverty might spread by air. Karen set her bundle on an overturned crate and tried to count what remained. 3 small coins, half a heel of bread wrapped in cloth, 1 iron key pressed warm against her skin. No room, no reference, no legal paper in her favour, and noon already behind her. She asked at the side door whether the inn needed a reader for letters, a copyist, a nursery maid, any temporary hand. The cook's assistant who answered looked at her cracked knuckles, then at her dress, and said they were full. By the time the church clock struck 1, the rain had thickened into sleet again, hissing where it hit manure-wet straw. Karen's fingers had gone stiff around the cloth-wrapped bread. She had eaten none of it. Hunger and caution argued in her stomach without conclusion. A carrier shouted for room at the gate. A pair of bays backed badly against a dray and set 3 chickens screaming in a basket. The ordinary chaos of the yard went on. She held herself very still in its edge, trying to look useful rather than desperate, because men hired usefulness and avoided desperation as if it were plague. Then the yard changed in one hard breath. A team swung in too fast from the north road, 4 matched greys black with rain, harness bells clashing out of rhythm. 1 horse slipped at the turn, recovered, then threw its head high and screamed. The near wheel struck a ridge of frozen mud and jolted. A child's cry cut through the noise, sharp and stunned. The small figure on the lead pony in the train behind the coach pitched sideways as the pony shied, hit the ground in a tangle of reins and lay still long enough to freeze every bystander in place. Men shouted at once. Someone ran toward the horse's head. Someone else shouted for a surgeon who was not there. Karen moved before she knew she had moved. Her parcel fell to the muck. She dropped to her knees beside the boy, slid one hand under his shoulder, and touched his throat with 2 fingers. Pulse. Fast. Thin. Present. His eyes were open but unfocused, breath catching in short pulls that ended in little gasps. His left wrist lay at an angle no wrist should hold. She tore a long strip from her petticoat hem with both hands, teeth set against the rip, and spoke to him in the low, even tone her father had used with panicked colts. "Do not look at your arm. Look at me. Breathe when I count." He tried, failed, tried again. She counted aloud, steady and slow, and splinted the wrist against a short length of fallen shaft wood from the yard, binding cloth tight enough to hold and loose enough for blood. His fingers twitched when she touched them. "Good!" She lifted his hand higher, resting it against her own shoulder to reduce the swelling already rising at the joint. Boots struck mud behind her. A man's shadow fell across both of them. "Leave him! The servants will tend him!" The voice cut clean, trained to command rooms and roads and men with reins in their fists. Karen did not look up. "Your Grace, if he is moved now, he may lose the hand." Silence met her for one beat, then another, as if the yard itself had missed a step. She felt the weight of attention turn with almost physical force. Only then did she raise her eyes. He stood close enough that rain from his greatcoat hem spattered her sleeve. Tall, broad through the shoulders, even bent slightly from the dismount. Dark hair wet against his brow. A narrow line of blood ran from his temple to his jaw, where the coach lamp bracket had caught him. His face held no visible pain. His eyes were the cold grey of river water under stormlight, fixed first on the boy, then on the improvised splint, then on Karen's bare, red hands with cloth tied around a child's bones. The Duke of Halbrook. Everyone in 3 counties knew that face and the stories attached to it. Widower, landholder, a man who had returned from war with a scar at his shoulder and a manner that made even magistrates straighten when he entered. Karen felt rank settle into the space between them like iron bars, mud on her skirt, blood at his temple, her hands on his child. He knelt without looking away from her work, one knee in the muck, gloved hand braced on the ground. "Elias," he said, and the single name carried an effort she had not expected. "Look at me." The boy's gaze wavered past him and fixed on Karen instead. "It hurts." "I know," she answered. "Pain means you are here with us." She began humming under her breath, a low line from a psalm tune her father had used when storms shook the windows and she was small enough to believe thunder meant judgment. The melody steadied her own breathing as much as the child's. His shoulders loosened by degrees. His breath lengthened. The yard noise receded to a dull ring around the 3 of them. A groom reached for the boy's coat. The Duke lifted one hand without turning his head. The groom stopped where he stood. "Can he be carried?" the Duke asked. "On a door or board," Karen said. "Arms supported, no jarring. He must be warm, and someone should watch his pupils for the next hour." She glanced at the blood at the Duke's temple before she could stop herself. "You also should sit." His gaze cut to her face, sharp as flint. "I am not the concern." "Then your son is fortunate one of us can count." For a heartbeat she thought she had signed her own dismissal from whatever uncertain corner of shelter the inn wall had offered. The Duke's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped once near his ear, Then he gave 2 precise orders to the nearest men, and they moved at once. A stable door was lifted from hinges. Blankets were brought. The boy was transferred exactly as she directed, his cry brief and hoarse, his fingers clutching at her sleeve until she laid her hand over his and kept humming the same line. When they lifted him, her cuff slid back. The sleeve caught on splintered wood and tore 1/2 an inch. Her forearm showed in the grey light, thin and pale with yellowing marks at the wrist, and a darker bruise above the elbow where fingers had once closed too hard. She pulled the cuff down immediately, but not before she saw his eyes track the motion and stop. "Who did that?" She felt heat rise in her face despite the sleet. "I struck a latch." "Liar!" The word was quiet. Worse for being quiet. "You are covered in bruises, your dress is wet through, your hands are split, you are not in this yard by choice." She should have denied it again. She should have stepped back, lowered her head, and let rank pass over her as weather passed over stone. Instead, she said, "No, Your Grace, I am here because I have nowhere else to stand." Something in his expression altered, not softness, not pity, but a stillness that looked dangerously like decision. The boy, wrapped now in 2 blankets, reached for Karen when the men bore him toward the inn door. "Do not go." The Duke turned his head slightly toward the threshold, then back to her. "Come inside. You are shaking." "I am wet, not welcome." "You are under my instruction." His voice left no room to argue in public. "Inside." She rose carefully because her knees had stiffened in the cold mud. When she stood, the yard tilted for 1 instant, then steadied. The Duke remained kneeling a fraction longer than necessary. One hand pressed briefly to his temple, where blood had reached his collar. She saw the glove come away red at the fingertips. He ignored it, stood, and fell into step beside the makeshift litter carrying Elias through the side entrance. Heat struck Karen's face at once in the inn passage, thick with broth, wet wool, and horse. Servants parted at the Duke's approach as if pulled by rope. No one barred Karen when she followed at his shoulder. They took Elias into a private parlour near the kitchen range. A maid fetched hot water. Another brought bandages from a surgeon's chest kept for travellers. Karen guided the boy's breathing while the innkeeper's wife cut his sleeve and set the arm more securely under her instruction. Elias cried once, then buried his face against the blanket and went rigid with exhausted silence. Only when the child's pulse slowed under her fingers did Karen step back. Her own hands had begun to tremble in earnest now that action had ended. She wrapped them in her torn petticoat cloth and looked for a corner where she might disappear without giving offence. The Duke closed the parlour door with deliberate care, shutting out the corridor noise. He removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. Blood had dried at his temple in a narrow dark line. Up close she could see a white scar near his collarbone, where the greatcoat had shifted, old and puckered, pulling slightly when he moved his left shoulder. War, then, or some other old violence he carried beneath linen and command. "Your name," he said. "Karen Stewart." "Of Stewart House." The question was flat, but she heard the recognition beneath it. She did not know whether that would save or ruin her. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at her parcel, mud-streaked and half-open on the chair where someone had dropped it, the wrapped bread visible inside beside a needle packet, and nothing more. He looked at her shoes, water pooling beneath them. He looked at the torn hem she had used for Elias's splint. "Where are you lodged?" She held his gaze because lowering her eyes now would feel like a lie. "Nowhere." He took 1 step toward the hearth and stood with his back to the fire, large enough to block half its light. "My son has not spoken in full sentences to any stranger since his mother died. He spoke to you in this room within 10 minutes. Karen did not answer. There was no safe answer. He will travel to Halbrook Court as soon as the surgeon permits movement, the Duke said. You will come with us, temporarily, as his companion. The words landed almost as heavily as Mrs. Stewart's order had that dawn, yet they struck from the opposite direction. Command, not dismissal. Inclusion, not erasure. The risk in it was immediate and vast. A duke's household could protect or swallow a woman like her with equal ease. I have no references, she said. Mrs. Stewart will not provide one. I did not ask Mrs. Stewart. His eyes held hers without wavering. I saw you work. That is reference enough. She thought of the locked attic door, the coal shed hasp, the street looking away while she stood with one parcel in rain. She thought of Mr. Bell wheezing under thin blankets. She thought of what it meant for a powerful man to offer shelter in the same tone another had used to cast her out. Not rescue. Not yet. Merely a different threshold and the same question waiting at it. From the bed by the range, Elias stirred and whispered, hoarse with fatigue, "Please stay." The Duke did not move. His hand resting on the chair back tightened once until the knuckles paled. "Answer him," he said, "and answer me." Karen turned first to the bed by the range because the child had asked before the father had commanded. Elias's lashes were wet against skin gone chalk pale with shock. His mouth trembled when he tried to hold still. She stepped to him and laid her hand lightly over the blanket where his uninjured arm lay, tucked. "I will stay while you are in pain," she said. "You have my word." His fingers loosened their grip on the wool, just enough to breathe. Then she faced the Duke. The fire behind him threw his profile into hard planes, cheekbone and jaw cut like stone. Rain clicked against the window panes in fast, cold taps. His temples still bled in a thin, dark line that had reached the edge of his collar. "I will come as companion if the appointment is honest," she said. "Wages entered in your household book, a chamber with a lock and key in my own hand. And if your son dismisses me, I go at once, without accusation." His gaze did not leave her face. "Done. I also require one liberty, Your Grace." A fraction of movement at his brow. "Permission. There is an old groom at Stewart House, Mr. Bell. He is ill. I bought laudanum this morning and sent it to him. If I leave the parish today, I must know he has medicine for the week." The Duke held her in silence long enough for her to hear the kitchen ladle striking copper in the passage beyond the door. Then he nodded once. "You will write what he needs. It will be delivered before dusk." He did not ask why she spent her last coin on a servant who could repay nothing. He did not call it foolishness. That omission struck her harder than praise could have done. A knock came, brisk and deferential. The innkeeper's wife entered with a surgeon in a wet cloak and a leather case darkened by rain. The man bowed to the Duke, then to the boy, then looked at Karen with quick assessment before kneeling beside the bed. "Fracture at the wrist," she said before he could ask. "Splintered in the yard. Fingers remain warm." The surgeon's mouth tightened in professional surprise. He touched Elias's hand, tested pulse, checked pupils with a small brass lens. "Who set this?" "I did, sir," Karen answered. He gave one short nod. "You bought him time." The Duke stepped aside but did not leave. He stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped behind him, shoulders rigid under soaked wool. Karen saw what others might miss. His right hand stayed steady. His left flexed once, then went still again, as if obeying an old discipline learned where fear was punished. The surgeon opened his case. Linen rolls, narrow splints, a small stoppered vial. The smell of spirits rose sharp and medicinal. "We must set it properly," the surgeon told Elias. It will hurt for a moment." Elias's eyes flew to Karen, not to his father, not to the surgeon. Karen moved to the pillow and bent close so the boy could fix on her voice and not on the man unwrapping bandages. "Look at me again. We shall count as we did in the yard. You have done this once. You can do it twice." His lower lip quivered. "Do not let him leave." She looked across the bed to the Duke. "Your Grace, he needs your hand on his shoulder, firmly, not his arm." For one beat, perhaps two, he did not move, not refusal. Something older and colder than refusal. Then he came to the bedside and placed his palm where she indicated, broad and careful, through the blanket. Elias's breath hitched and then steadied under the weight. The surgeon glanced up, surprised by obedience given to a woman in a torn dress, and returned to his work. "Now!" Pain ripped through the child in a strangled cry. Karen counted aloud, 1 through 10. Again! Again! Her voice never rose. Elias buried his face against her sleeve and clung until his fingers cramped, but he didn't thrash. The set was clean, fresh splints were tied, bandage crossed and pinned. The surgeon checked circulation once more and leaned back on his heels, breath visible in the cooler air near the floor. "Well done, young sir," he said. Elias's answer was a wet, exhausted sound close to a sob. Karen wiped his cheeks with the edge of a clean cloth and resumed the psalm melody under her breath, softer now, hardly more than breath shaped into notes. When the surgeon turned to speak with the Duke near the hearth, Karen heard enough to catch the essentials. No travel tonight if fever rose. Keep him warm, broth in small amounts, wake him each hour and ask his name, the day, his father's title, watch for confusion, watch for vomiting, watch for unequal pupils. She stored each instruction with the mechanical precision of someone who had kept sickbeds before, without credit and without relief. By the time the church clock at Market Cross struck 2, the sleet had thinned to rain, and the rooms smelled of damp wool, beeswax, and boiled willow bark. The surgeon had gone to prepare powders. The innkeeper's wife had brought broth and then withdrawn at a glance from the Duke. Elias drank 3 spoonfuls, no more. His eyes drifted shut and opened again in frightened starts whenever Karen shifted her hand. At last the Duke stepped toward the bed. "Elias!" The boy's lashes lifted. "I must speak with my steward. I will return." Elias gave a tiny shake of his head, panic flaring faster than reason. "No!" The Duke went very still. Karen felt the child's pulse jump under her fingers. She could not let him spend that surge. Not now. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "if you go, he believes he has been abandoned. If you remain in sight, he will sleep." A muscle in the Duke's jaw tightened. He looked toward the door, then back to his son. The conflict crossed his face like weather over a winter field, stark and without shelter. When he answered, the words were clipped thin. "Then I remain." He took the chair by the bed and sat with soldierly straightness, as though stillness itself were duty. Karen resumed her place on the other side. Between them lay a child whose breathing finally lengthened into the deep, uneven rhythm of exhausted sleep. For a long stretch no one spoke. Fire settled in the grate with soft collapses. Rain eased. Somewhere below a wagon rolled from the yard, wheels grinding wet gravel. Karen became aware of her own hunger only when her stomach cramped hard enough to make her press a hand against her apron. She ignored it. Elias slept. The Duke's temple had begun to bead fresh blood where the cut reopened. A thin line tracked toward his cheek again. She watched it once, looked away, then back when it reached his jaw. "Your Grace, your wound should be cleaned." "It is nothing." "It was bleeding in the yard, and it is bleeding now." His eyes shifted to hers. There was no anger in them, only fatigue held under iron control. "Attend to the child." "The child is sleeping." She held his gaze, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "If you faint, he wakes in terror. Sit by the basin." Perhaps it was the logic. Perhaps it was the tone she had used on frightened horses and stubborn boys, and one dying man who refused broth because it tasted of surrender. Whatever it was, he rose without argument and crossed to the washstand. She poured warm water into the basin. The cloth came away pink, then red, then clean. The cut was narrow but deep enough to sting. She dabbed spirits along the edge. His shoulders locked hard at the burn, though he made no sound. Up close she could see faint silver lines near his hairline, older scars hidden unless the light caught them. This man carried history in tissue and posture both. "You should have had this stitched," she murmured. "I have had worse." "I do not doubt it." His mouth shifted, not quite a smile, gone before it settled. When she finished, she tied a strip of clean linen around his temple and secured it at the nape. Her fingers brushed the rough edge of his hair, then withdrew at once. Heat rose along her throat for reasons she refused to name. She stepped back. "There, it will hold until your surgeon sees it again." He looked at her torn hem, the mud drying on her skirt, the raw lines across her knuckles where lie had split the skin. "You have not eaten." "I am accustomed." "That was not the question." She did not answer. He crossed to the side table, took up the tray untouched by his son, and held it out. Bread, broth, a small wedge of cheese. Command disguised as hospitality again. "Eat." She accepted because argument would waste strength and because refusal would insult the household authority that now, however temporarily, covered her. She took the smallest portion and left the rest. He noticed, said nothing, returned to the chair by Elias and resumed that rigid, watchful stillness, as if movement itself might disturb the boy's fragile sleep. After a time the door opened a hand's breadth, and a man in dark travelling clothes entered with quiet efficiency, hat in hand, water on his shoulders, mid-40s, spare, composed, a steward's face. "Your Grace, Mr. Fenwick." The Duke did not rise. "This is Miss Karen Stewart. She enters my household today as temporary companion to my son." Fenwick's eyes moved to Karen, taking in every visible fact with the trained neutrality of a man who kept records that outlived tempers. He bowed. "Miss Stewart." Karen inclined her head and waited. "Prepare rooms in the East Wing nursery corridor," the Duke said. "One for Elias, one adjoining for Miss Stewart, both with interior locks. Place her name in the wages ledger at companion's rate. Effective this day. Advance 1 month. Yes, Your Grace. No household member is to question her authority over Elias's regimen while he recovers. If there is dispute, it comes to me." Fenwick's expression did not alter, but Karen saw recognition pass behind his eyes. Not of her, of the rarity of such explicit instruction. "I understand, Your Grace." Karen reached into her bodice and drew out the small iron key Martha had given her. She held it a moment, feeling its weight in her palm, then wrapped it again in cloth and returned it to safety. One key found, one room lost, another promised. Trust came slower than words. "Mr. Fenwick," she said before he could step away, "I must trouble you with a delivery." The steward paused and looked to the Duke. A nod granted permission. "There is a man named Bell in the rear coach shed at Stewart House," Karen said. "He needs laudanum, broth and dry wool. I can provide directions and coin." "You will provide directions," the Duke said. "Keep your coin." Karen met his eyes. "It is my debt. It is now mine to discharge?" She understood then that refusal would not be read as pride, but as resistance to an order made for protection and for speed. She lowered her gaze briefly. "As you command, Your Grace." Fenwick produced a notebook from his coat. Karen gave precise directions through the service lane, the loose gate latch, the third stall behind the broken phaeton, and the warning that Mrs. Stewart's steward might deny entry unless shown purchased goods and paid in full at handover. Fenwick wrote every detail. No flourish, no comment. "I will send a rider within the quarter hour," he said, "and I will require a signed receipt from whoever accepts the parcel." "Thank you," Karen answered, the words rougher than she intended. When Fenwick had gone, the Duke looked at her with that same unnerving directness he had used in the yard. "You expected refusal. I expected delay. You will find less of it at Halbrook." She thought of Stewart House, where delay had been a method, punishment, strategy. Delayed meals, delayed keys, delayed answers until rights withered from disuse. She did not trust ease yet, but she believed efficiency when she saw it. A light knock came again. This time it was the surgeon returning with a folded paper and 2 packets of powder. He checked Elias, approved the sleep, and left instructions with Karen, not with the Duke, because he had seen whose hands the child sought when pain rose. The Duke observed the transfer without visible offence. That too, she marked. The afternoon darkened early under low cloud. Candles were lit in the parlour, their glow softening the hard edges of furniture and face alike. Elias woke once, in confusion. Karen asked his name. He answered. She asked the day. He faltered, then found it. She asked who sat beside him. His gaze moved to his father and fixed. "My father." The Duke exhaled once, a sound almost too small to hear. Later, when Elias slept again, a stable lad arrived with mud to his knees, and Fenwick's receipt, signed by the steward at Stewart House and countersigned by Mr. Bell with a shaky mark. Laudanum delivered, broth delivered, wool delivered, paid in full. Karen read the names twice to be certain. Something in her chest unclenched by one narrow degree. She folded the paper and offered it to the Duke. "It concerns your household business now." He did not take it. "Keep it. For what purpose? For proof that what you ask is done." The words settled in her like warmth. Not comfort, not safety yet, but evidence. She placed the receipt inside her parcel beside the needle and the remaining crust of bread, a small archive against erasure. Outside, carriage wheels sounded in the yard as fresh horses were harnessed under lantern light. The rain had weakened to mist. Travel would be possible by evening if Elias held steady through the next waking. Karen rose to adjust the blanket at the child's shoulder. The Duke stood as she did, close enough that she could feel the retained heat of his coat and the contained force in a body trained to action and denied it for hours. He spoke without preamble, voice low so as not to wake the boy. "You gave orders to a duke in a public yard. You bound my son's arm with your own clothing. You spent your last coin on a man no one sees. You have asked for wages, locks, and ledger entry before gratitude. Good." She looked up, caught by the final word. He held her gaze. "You will ride in my carriage to Halbrook Court at dusk," he said, "and you will continue to do precisely as you did today." The order struck Karen with the force of a door bolted from the inside. "Continue as you did today. No ornament in it, no courtesy phrase to soften it. Yet no one had ever spoken to her labour as if it were a standard to be kept." She folded her hands to hide their tremor. "Your Grace, what I did today was necessity. It was judgment." His voice stayed low, the words shaped for her alone. Accurate judgment under pressure. I have men who fail at less. The compliment, if it was one, felt almost harsher than rebuke. She did not know where to place it. She turned back to Elias and adjusted the blanket at his shoulder because cloth and pulse and breath were knowable things. Behind her, the Duke did not step away. From the bed came a small sound. Elias's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpened with sudden alarm when he saw candlelight instead of sky. "Are we leaving now?" "Not this minute," Karen said. "You are warm. Your arm is set. We wait for the surgeon's next look." The boy swallowed. "Will she come?" The Duke answered before Karen could. "She rides with us." Elias settled at once, as if the line itself had weight. His lashes lowered again. Karen looked up. The Duke had not shifted his stance. He stood with one hand on the bedpost, broad shoulders between child and door, as though his body had taken up guard without requiring his consent. A footman entered with fresh coals for the grate, and nearly dropped the scuttle when he saw Karen standing so near the Duke. His glance skittered over her torn hem, her plain bodice, then fixed on the floor. The Duke did not turn. "Set it down," he said. The man obeyed at once, bent to the hearth and backed out. "Tell the innkeeper this parlour is closed," the Duke added. "No callers, no inquiries, no messages delivered through servants' mouths. Mr. Fenwick will receive all communication." "Yes, Your Grace." The door shut. The latch clicked. Karen felt the command settle around the room like ironwork, plain and unadorned and absolutely protective. She had asked for a lock and key. He had locked the corridor itself. She poured water from the ewer to keep her hands occupied. "Mrs. Stewart may send someone when she learns I have left." "She may send 10. He moved then, only enough to take the clean cup she offered Elias. "They will not pass my steward." "You speak as if she has no claim." "She has claims enough to occupy courts for years." His eyes lifted to hers, steady and cold. "You asked for honest terms. You shall have them. While you are under my roof, no person enters your chamber without your consent. No wages are withheld for discipline. No household correction is performed on your body by anyone at any rank." The cup in Karen's hand struck the basin rim with a sharp, betraying sound. She set it down before she spilled it. "I did not ask for the last condition, Your Grace." "No, you should not have had to." He glanced once at the bruise that had escaped her cuff in the yard, then looked away as if naming it aloud might be indecency. "I am asking it for you." The words opened a narrow, dangerous warmth low in her chest. She crushed it quickly. Warmth had cost her before. Promises had cost more. "And if I fail your son?" His mouth hardened. "Then I will say so plainly and pay what is due. I do not dismiss by lock." Silence followed. Fire shifted in the grate. Elias drank 2 swallows with eyes closed and drifted again, still clutching the edge of Karen's sleeve. She tried to ease the fabric free. The boy's fingers tightened in sleep. "Leave it," the Duke said. She sat because there was no way to stand without waking him. The chair edge pressed against her bruised thigh. Her stomach knotted again with hunger, then loosened when she remembered the small cheese left on the tray. She did not reach for it. The Duke noticed anyway, reached behind him without looking, and placed the plate within her hand's reach. "Eat," he said. She obeyed this time without argument. Bread tasted of salt and yeast and relief she did not trust. She ate slowly, keeping one hand on Elias's blanket. The Duke remained at the bedpost, unmoving, linen binding white against his dark hair where she had tied it. By the time the bell of St. Jude's struck the half-hour after 5, twilight had turned the window panes to dull lead. The surgeon returned, checked Elias's pupils and pulse, pronounced him fit to travel if kept upright and still, and left powders for pain with strict intervals marked in a quick, slanted hand. Karen repeated each instruction back. He corrected one measure. She repeated it again. Satisfied, he bowed to the Duke and departed. Mr. Fenwick came next with a leather folio and a sealed packet. "Your Grace, the East Wing rooms are prepared. Nurse Talbot has been informed of Miss Stuart's authority regarding the young master's regimen. A travelling screen has been fitted into the carriage to reduce draught. The parcel to Mr. Bell was acknowledged. I have also brought the appointment draft for Miss Stuart's signature should she wish to review." He held the folio toward Karen, not the Duke. That courtesy, so simple, nearly undid her. She took the document and read by candlelight. "Companion to Master Elias Holbrook. Wages quarterly, paid monthly in advance during convalescence. Separate chamber with private key. Dismissal upon written notice with 2 weeks' wages in lieu of immediate departure except in criminal breach." Her hands slowed over each line, tracing legal bones beneath language. She found one omission. "There is no clause for books or correspondence," she said. Fenwick inclined his head. "Shall I add unrestricted access to household library by request and private post, reviewed only for contraband?" Karen looked to the Duke, uncertain whether she had asked too much. He did not hesitate. "Add it." Fenwick wrote in a narrow margin with precise strokes, sanded the ink, and turned the folio back. Karen read the addition twice, then signed. Her name looked thin and severe on the heavy paper. Fenwick countersigned, then produced a small ring of 2 keys on plain ribbon. "East room door, adjoining communicating door," he said. "The outer corridor lock is controlled by you from inside." Karen took them. Cold brass pressed into her palm, heavier than Martha's little iron key, heavier than it had any right to be. She closed her fingers and did not speak for a moment. Fenwick set the sealed packet beside her plate. "Advance wages, as instructed." She opened it when he left. Notes and coin. Real sum. Not charity tucked in a maid's hand. Not alms. Pay. The Duke watched her fold the packet into her parcel with deliberate care. "Keep accounts," he said. "If any figure does not reconcile, bring it to Fenwick. If Fenwick is absent, bring it to me. I thought dukes did not examine household pennies. Pennies become pounds when no one watches." The line came from experience, perhaps from injury. She heard the old wound in it and did not press. She tied her parcel closed and slipped the key ribbon around her wrist beneath her cuff. Metal rested against pulse. Outside the parlour, the inn-yard grew louder as departure neared. Harness buckles rang. Men called to one another in short bursts. A horse stamped, then another. Elias woke at the first roll of wheels and fought to sit. "Easy," Karen said, bracing his shoulders. "We go now, but slowly. I do not want the dark carriage." "You will have light," the Duke said. "And me." The child turned his head with suspicion born of grief. "You say that, then you go." The Duke took the accusation without flinch. He crossed to the bed and crouched until he and Elias were eye level. "I will not leave the carriage." "Not even at the gate?" "Not at the gate. Not to speak to soldiers. Not to speak to anyone." Elias considered him a long second, then extended his uninjured hand. The Duke clasped it. His broad fingers nearly swallowed the small ones, yet his grip stayed careful, almost reverent. He did not release until Elias did. The transfer from bed to carriage took 4 men, 1 board, 2 blankets, and Karen walking backward with her hand under Elias's neck, so the splintered wrist stayed high and still. Rain had thinned to mist that silvered the yard lanterns. Cold struck her face. Mud sucked at boots. She heard whispers as they crossed the inn threshold. "That is Stuart's girl." "In the Duke's train?" "Hush." No one hushed quickly enough for her not to hear. Shame rose hot, then cooled when she saw the Duke turn his head once toward the voices. He said nothing. He did not need to. The whispers died. The carriage stood ready under the awning, black panels slick with damp, lamps already lit. Fenwick had done as promised. Inside, a padded bench had been converted into a narrow berth with bolsters. A small brazier box was secured in a corner grate. Extra blankets, hot bricks wrapped in flannel, surgeon's packet tied above reach. Order everywhere. Karen climbed first and settled at the inner side so Elias could lean against her without straining his arm. The Duke handed the boy up himself, then followed and took the opposite bench. Fenwick moved to close the door. "Wait," the Duke said. He looked across at Karen. In the close carriage light his face seemed carved from winter itself, but his eyes were not on her bruises now. They were on the keys at her wrist. "Show me," he said. She frowned, uncertain. "The lock." Understanding came a beat later. She reached to the carriage door, turned the inner bolt, and heard it engage with a solid click. She drew it back. Engaged again, drew it back again. The Duke nodded once. "You lock it when we move. You open for no one but me or Fenwick." "Yes, Your Grace." He held her gaze one breath longer. "If I am absent," Fenwick gives the phrase. "What phrase?" "Stuart House has no claim." The sentence was so specific, so impossible for a stranger to guess, that for the first time all day Karen felt the shape of strategy around her, not just force. He had thought past this hour, past this road, past whatever legal and social reach Mrs. Stuart might attempt. The crack ran through him there, visible and irreversible. A man accustomed to command had chosen to use command as shelter, and he had named her history as a thing to be defended. Fenwick shut the carriage door. Iron met iron. Karen slid the bolt as ordered. Outside the driver called. Reins snapped, and the coach lurched forward into the wet evening road. Within the swaying dark, Elias's head settled against her shoulder after the first mile. His breathing deepened. Karen kept one hand at his splint and the other on the key ribbon under her cuff, counting turns by instinct. Across from her, the Duke sat with his boots braced and his hands flat on his knees, watching the boy's face each time the wheels struck a rut. He did not sleep. He did not look away. When the carriage rocked hard at a culvert, he was already half risen, palm out to steady both child and companion in a single motion, then still again as soon as the motion passed. They rode like that through gathering dark, 3 figures held in a narrow pool of lamplight, and the Duke of Halbrook kept his word by the minute. He did not leave the carriage once. The coach lamps threw long gold bars across the yew trunks as Halbrook Court rose out of the mist, stone upon stone, too large to be called welcoming and too ordered to be called cruel. Karen felt Elias stir at each change in the wheels. She kept his splintered wrist lifted on the folded blanket as the carriage climbed the final incline. The Duke did not speak. He watched the child's face until the coach stopped under the portico, and the grooms came at once, silent and efficient in dark livery. Nurse Talbot waited at the top of the steps, grey-haired, square-shouldered, apron white as the chapel linen. Her eyes moved over Karen once, quick and measuring, then to Elias. "We are ready, Your Grace." "Board transfer," the Duke said. "No jolting." They moved him inside on a narrow litter. Karen walked beside his head, counting breaths again. Heat met them in the corridor, wax and cedar and banked coal. At the nursery suite threshold, Elias's fingers found her sleeve in sleep and held. Nurse Talbot noticed. She said nothing. She only stepped aside and opened the inner door with her own key. When Elias lay settled and medicated, Karen stood at the adjoining chamber Mr. Fenwick had prepared for her. Small, clean and plain. A narrow bed, a writing table, a jug of hot water wrapped in flannel, and a brass lock on the inside of both doors. She shut the outer door first and tested the key from the ribbon. The mechanism caught with a solid, unmistakable turn. She opened it again, closed it again. Then she crossed to the communicating door, tested that lock also, and rested her forehead briefly against the panel. Wood under skin, a boundary she controlled. A soft knock came from the corridor. "Miss Stewart!" Fenwick's voice. She opened. He held out 2 wrapped bundles and a folded paper. "From Stewart House. Delivered under witness this evening." Her breath caught. The first bundle held her mother's dark green shawl and the winter boots, cracked but mended at the split seam. The second held her books, tied in rough twine, and the little ivory comb with 2 broken teeth tucked between pages of the Latin grammar. The folded paper was a new receipt, inventory executed, goods transferred, signed by Stewart House steward and countersigned by the constable Fenwick had engaged. Attached was a smaller scrap in an uneven hand. "Miss Karen, I put by what I could. The blue ribbon copybooks are all here." "Martha," Karen whispered. Fenwick gave one short nod. "She asked that no reply be sent. She is watched." Karen pressed the books to her chest. "Thank you. There is one more matter." He lowered his voice. "A lockbox was named in your instructions. It was not in the coal shed." Karen touched the iron key beneath her collar. "It was hidden in my attic chamber. Behind the washstand, perhaps. Then we shall require lawful entry at daylight." By the first clear morning after her arrival, sleet had finally broken into hard blue sky. Elias woke confused, but answered each question correctly. Name, day, father. When Karen read from the Psalter in a low voice, he completed 2 lines without prompting. The Duke stood in the doorway and watched without entering, until the boy, drowsy again, reached for Karen's hand and slept with his fingers wrapped around hers. At noon, Fenwick returned with a solicitor and a parish constable. They rode to Stewart House in the Duke's second carriage, with Karen seated opposite the solicitor, her parcel in her lap and the iron key in her fist. No one spoke much. Wheels hissed on wet road. Her stomach tightened as the familiar yews came into view. "Min tiditos." Stewart met them in the front passage. Dove-grey silk, lavender water, spine straight as a drawn blade. Amelia and Louisa stood behind her, pale and bright and angry. "You bring officers into my house," the solicitor answered before Karen could. "Madam, this is a court order for inventory and recovery of trust papers and personal effects belonging to Miss Karen Stewart." Mrs. Stewart's gaze snapped to Karen. "She has stolen wages and household property. I was preparing my own complaint." "File it," Fenwick said evenly. "You may add it to the docket already opened for fraudulent conveyance." Colour rose hard along Mrs. Stewart's throat. "How dare you!" Boots sounded on the corridor runner. The Duke entered without haste, greatcoat unfastened, expression cut from winter stone. "No one removes Miss Stewart from this room," he said. Silence fell so fast Karen heard the clock in the morning room strike once. The inventory proceeded under witness. In the attic corridor, the fresh paint on Karen's old door still shone. The brass lock still looked new. She placed Martha's iron key into the hidden notch behind the washstand panel, exactly where memory told her it would be. The panel shifted. Inside sat the cedar writing box her father had given her at 16, scratched at one corner, intact. Her hands shook only once as she opened it. Inside lay 3 copybooks in blue ribbon, her father's note on upper pasture bounds, a folded settlement deed bearing her mother's name, and a thin packet of correspondence with seals broken long ago. The solicitor read in the corridor light, turning each page with careful fingers. His mouth flattened. "Marriage Settlement Trust. income reserved to issue of first marriage, not assignable by step-parent authority. He lifted another paper from Mrs. Stewart's household ledger bundle, seized by constable from the study downstairs. Here is the forged rider used to lease the room and pledge trust income. Signature imitated, seal wrong. Mrs. Stewart laughed once, brittle and high. That is absurd. It is criminal, the solicitor said. Back in the morning room she tried to gather force by volume. She accused Karen of ingratitude, of manipulation, of setting herself above station. Louisa echoed every phrase. Amelia repeated burden twice, like a refrain rehearsed in advance. The Duke did not raise his voice. Liar! She fed your house with her labour while you sold what was hers. Mrs. Stewart took one step toward Karen, gloved hand half lifted. The constable moved between them before contact. The solicitor read the writ aloud. Fraudulent transfer, unlawful conversion of trust property, immediate suspension of household authority pending magistrate's order, temporary removal from Stewart House to lodgings under surety. Amelia began to cry. Louisa stood very still, face emptied of colour. Mrs. Stewart looked at Karen with naked hatred and something else beneath it. A cold calculation searching for one more purchase that did not exist. Martha knew, she said suddenly. Your little maid carried notes. Karen held her gaze. Martha carried kindness. You mistook it for weakness. The constable escorted Mrs. Stewart and her daughters out through the front portico under public witness. No scene beyond clipped protest and rustling silk. Neighbours watched from behind curtains. No one intervened. Before leaving, Karen crossed once more to the attic chamber. The new tenant had gone. Her old stool stood where she remembered. Frost marks traced the inside pane. She set her books on the sill, slid the father's note back into the writing box, and replaced the panel with her own hand. That evening at Halbrook Court, 3 signed documents lay on the library table. Recovery inventory filed, trust income restored, and a deed establishing a small annuity for Mr. Bell's care to be administered by Mrs. Davies, and paid quarterly from Karen's recovered funds. Karen signed the annuity first. Mr. Bell will have broth and coal without asking, she said. Fenwick sanded the ink. It will be done tomorrow. The Duke dismissed everyone with a glance. When the door closed, only firelight and paper remained between them. You stood in that house and did not bend, he said. I bent for years. You did not break. He stepped closer, not touching her. Marry me. The words were plain, almost severe. No ornament, no kneeling, no audience. Karen's pulse struck hard once, twice. She thought of locked doors, of orders used as shelter, of the way he had listened when she named terms the first night at the inn. I will not be kept as gratitude, she said, nor taken up and put down at convenience. If I stand beside you, I stand as equal in law and in household authority. His answer came without pause. Done. I keep my income in my name. Yes. My room remains mine, key in my hand. Yes. If your son calls, I answer before etiquette. Always. She let one breath go. Then yes, your grace. The wedding took place in the chapel at Halbrook 6 days later, morning grey and windless, with Elias between them and Nurse Talbot holding his good hand. No ball, no parade. Fenwick signed as witness. Mrs. Davies came in her best black and wept once behind her glove when the register was closed. By the 2nd week of April, Karen returned to Stewart House, not as a petitioner but as legal mistress of her own restored chambers within the trust property, now managed under court order until final transfer. She climbed the attic stair at dusk, boots dry, shawl mended, title newly hers, and still strange on every tongue. The fresh cream paint had been stripped, The old blue showed through in places where the grain lifted. She set a new brass key into the lock, turned it, and opened the door herself. Her copybooks waited on the shelf. Her father's psalter lay by the pane. On the table she placed the court order, the annuity receipt for Mr. Bell's first quarter, and the signed marriage register copy bearing her new name. Then she closed her fingers around the key and did not let it go until the fire had taken and the room was warm.